Hello my friends, today I will tell you an unusual story that has touched me deeply. It will not only be about the tank duel that took place in March 1945 in the city of Cologne, but also about the civilians who often become accidental victims of the war. Before Americans arrived there, Cologne was literally wiped out by Allied aircraft. The central part of the city suffered the most. The entire neighborhoods were destroyed, burned to the ground and turned into a pile of rubble by airstrikes. The war reached the Germans. They had to feel in full themselves what bombing is, fires, death and devastation. On the morning of 6 March 1945, the American 3rd Tank Division joined one of the 4 largest German cities, Cologne. They didn't expect serious resistance, as they knew that the command of the Wehrmacht had already managed to move the main forces to the other side of the Rhine, blowing up the bridges. They entered the city from the northwest of the Belgian Viertel area. Slowly but surely, the Americans advanced towards the center of the city, sometimes encountering resistance in the form of disparate enemy groups. Soon they noticed an enemy tank, and the situation took a very different turn. On this day, Cologne defended 106th Tank Brigade of German troops. They were a fire brigade that was supposed to delay the advance of Allied forces and cover up the deminers of the mine breach leading to the other side of the Rhine. The day before the operation, German equipment arrived on the outskirts of the city in the area of Ports 1 by rail from southern Germany. The condition of the tanks left much to be desired. We were informed that tomorrow we have advanced on a mission to the city center. In the morning, our crew, along with 2 other tanks, moved in the direction of the cathedral. 2 tanks immediately went to the station, moving across the Hohenzollern Bridge from the right bank to the left. Gustav Schäfer recalled, he was an 18-year-old shooter radio man of a German tank. The officer ordered us to go inland. He accompanied us for a while, but when it started to get heated and mortars started shelling it, he disappeared like if he was blown away with the wind. A total of 8 tank crews were sent on the mission that day. However, we cannot come far. Soon we met with a serious resistance, and during a brief battle from a powerful shot from 90mm gun of American tank Pershing, the wall of the house collapsed behind which stood our tank. The tower has been jammed. We were unable to return fire and left the vehicle. On the same day we were captured. Clarence Smoyer, the gunner of the American tank Pershing, recalls, when I noticed the enemy tank, we began to turn the gun in its direction, charge an armor-piercing projectile, but they managed to hide behind the buildings. So we decided to open a fire with a direct aim on the wall of the house. Later, I learned that no one of soldiers in tank was wounded, which I was sincerely pleased with. Some time before, a car suddenly drove into the war zone, which was shelled by the Americans and the Germans. After a series of shots, the car stopped on the right side of the street. Having stood like this for more than an hour. Also, under fire from the Americans came a man crossing the street. It's hard to call him lucky. He almost said goodbye to life when a hail of bullets flew in his direction. All through, he didn't show signs of aggressions or the slightest resistance. This is a war. Now you can only guess who he really was. Maybe it's a harmless civilian, and maybe this man was trying to scout the situation. And he would send a warm greetings from the window opening of the neighboring house opposite, discharge the anti-tank bomb into a column of armored vehicles. In the same car, which was fired by the Americans and Germans, were the girl and the man. When they realized that they had mistakenly opened fire on the civilian, they tried to provide first aid to the wounded girl. The man was already dead. The girl's name was Katarina Esser. She somehow managed to survive in this hell. Clarence Smoyer recalls, I remember that girl. I often dream of this episode of my life, and I'm haunted by the idea that I might have been involved in her death, and one of the bullets I fired overtook her. I saw the car when it jumped into the intersection in front of us, and I thought it would come after this and the others. It's hard to see, sitting in the tank, who is in the car. All I remember is that there was an army camouflage in the car, so I thought it was a German army vehicle. If I'd known that the girl was driving it, I would never have opened the fire. At the opposite end of the street, in a German tank, Gustav Schäfer was still sitting in a tank behind the machine gun. I kept shelling the ruins, because the infantrymen could be hiding there. And every time I saw someone on a pile of rubble, I would open the fire, he remembers. I was there. I didn't shoot the car on purpose. The car appeared suddenly. During the shooting, I saw in the sight that the car was heading just into the firing range. I don't know if I got caught or not. Most likely yes. When I got my hand off the trigger, it was too late. Clearing the way, the American soldiers went to the cathedral square, through the shortest path along the Komödienstraße. Two Allied tanks were advancing along the street. Only 100 meters remained to the entrance to the cathedral square, but the tank was blocked by a barricade. The head tank squeezed between the piles of rubble on the right side of the street. Its hull was almost completely hidden, towering only the tower. From here, the crew of the tank could shoot through the entire street up to the railway station located next to the cathedral. The second tank stopped nearby, in the corner on the left side of the street. Suddenly, the first projectile from the 75mm high-speed Panther gun flew into the mask of the gun of the leading American tank. After breaking through the armor, the projectile tore off the leg of the commander of the tank, Captain Kellner. The tank caught fire and everyone was trapped. At that moment, a second shell flew into the tank tower and struck the mask of the gun. Next to the first hole gaped the second one. The Panther's second shot put a greasy point in the life of 3 crew members of an American tank. Kellner hastily opened the hatch and climbed out of the fuming machine. Rolling over the engine room, he collapsed to the ground. He couldn't be saved and died of blood loss in a sinkhole near his tank. Shooter John Jelaka was shot in the leg by shrapnel. Following the commander from the commanding hatch, he climbed out and fell head down at the starboard side of the tank. For John, this was the second encounter with the German tanks on the way from Normandy to Cologne. He was very lucky to have survived this time. The third person who got out through the hatch of the hit tank was the driver's assistant Griffin. Sergeant Spears and driver Julian Patrick were killed instantly. The commander and assistant driver jumped out hastily from the second tank and rushed to help the wounded comrades. One rushed to get medics, the second one to the other tank. Stopping the attack of the Allies on Komödienstraße, the Panther took a position at the edge of the cathedral square, controlling traffic on both streets at the same time. It's not clear what crew commander took as a guidance. Yes, there were still battles around, but the war was coming to an end. Only 2 months remained until the final fall of the Third Reich. Now the Germans increasingly preferred to drop weapons rather than die with it in their hands. But the crew of this tank made a different decision. Now it's hard to say what it was. Clear pedantry following the instructions of command, heroism or simply recklessness. Meanwhile, US soldiers began planning an attack from the Marzellenstraße, intending to punch into a vulnerable spot directly into the board. The crew of the experimental tank M26 Pershing, who arrived on the front of Europe less than a month ago, decided to send the crew of this tank in Duel. His 90mm gun and thicker armor gave a much better chance of a successful outcome duel with a still German monster, which could easily deal with any American Sherman. But Americans didn't dare to attack the enemy tank in a hurry. First, the tank commander, Sergeant Robert Early, studied the area together with the front operator Jim Bates. They climbed on the surviving building. From there, the enemy tank was visible as lying in the palm of his hand. Cameraman Jim Bates stayed in the building to capture the tank Duel, and Robert Early returned to his combat vehicle and ordered to advance to Marzellenstraße. When our tank started to leave the corner, we met the enemy face to face. At a distance of about 100 meters, at the cathedral stood the Panther. Now the first shot will decide the fate of one of the tanks, as well as their crews. The crew of the Panther hesitated. Commander Bartelbord, who survived the battle, told his family after the war, "We expected that another Sherman would leave the corner of the street, but there was another tank. I was surprised and didn't immediately give the order to shoot. I didn't realize that it's an American tank. Moreover, in the first seconds I thought it was a German vehicle. Leaving the intersection, the driver of Pershing found in the periscope that the Panther's gun slowly turns in their direction. The gunner Clarence Smoyer didn't wait for his tank to stop, fired before the enemy gun had time to target them. We stopped, and I fired twice more. No one could be 100% sure that the Panther was hit. All 3 of our shells reached the target and penetrated the armor. 1 under a gun mask and 2 hit the board. After the first shoot, the hatch on the tower opened and one of the tank crew members tried to leave the burning vehicle. Another crew member appeared from the manhole of the radio operator. He managed to jump off the tank before hitting the tank for a second time. Someone from the driver's hatch also managed to get out of the burning machine. The second hit the Panther head to the lower part of the tower. After the control shot in the tank, the shells began to tear. 3 crew members trying to escape were soon captured, as they didn't run far. They were hiding in a bomb shelter under the cathedral, which also housed the hospital. 2 months and 3 days after this tank duel, the war has ended. But this is not the end of the story. Years later, gunner Clarence Smoyer and Gustav Schäfer met in Cologne and shook hands. They were no longer enemies, but they were united by the same car and the girl whose fate until now was not known. Gustav Schäfer and Clarence Smoyer wanted to know what happened to Katarina Esser. She was 27 years old. On that day she was caught in the crossfire in an Opel car. The car belonged to the owner of the vegetable shop, Hans Dilling, from whom Katarina worked for several years. It was Hans in the car in that day, and he died at the scene. Katarina's sister returned after the evacuation and first went to the vegetable shop to find out what happened to her sister. But she got a terrible message. According to a witness living on the street, she said that she had personally seen an American tank fire at the car, and after she had been given first aid, she was lying on the side of the road and was apparently waiting to be taken to the hospital. But unfortunately, she was ran over by the tank, and all what was left from here were some fragments of her body. Gustav and Clarence laid flowers at the mass grave where civilians who died in the storming of the city were buried in the cemetery near the church of Geryon, and they paid the tribute to the same girl who tragically died that day. Dear friends, I'm very interested in what you think about the story. When I was creating this video, I collected information literally, bit by bit, and tried to understand and restore the entire chronology of events. Looking back at it a few decades later, this Bloody March day seems absurd and ridiculous. But everything could have gone in a very different scenario. In the peaceful life of Katarina Esser most likely would have reached the destination. A person crossing the road would not run away from tracer bullets, and perhaps would go to someone to visit or just enjoy the spring March day of 1945. American tourists and Germans would drink beer peacefully in the local bar, and they would introduce during the jolly, chat and shake their hands while saying goodbye, not half a century later, but in the same 1945. At the moment when any of us admits the idea that he or she is better than the others, it creeps a small seeds of fascism in us. And adding to it a continuous propaganda about the Superman and exclusivity, then the whole generation would grow on these beliefs. And what kind of scenario unfold then you already guess. The end of war is near, and it depends on each of us. Well, I've got it all for today. Subscribe to the channel, press the like please, and see you soon!